number 11. We've made it to number 11. The magic number 11. I don't know. It's not magic. Number 11 in the 100 book challenge. I am only, what is that, 89 books away from being able to buy books again. What is number 11? It's not another one of the short books. This is one of the long books. I actually started reading this in December. like, it was slow going for me because of reasons. The name of this band is R.E.M. Peter Ames Carlin. It's one of my favorite bands of all time. Uh, if you are an R.E.M. fan, and you know who you are out there, you probably read this book already. If not, I would say go ahead. We're going to talk about it though. So, I mean, why would it take me 5.5 months to read this book? It's long. It's a big, chunky book, right? It's, text pages 409, and then with like all the indexes and whatnot. It's got a little, kind of the obligatory, can we say that? Little section of photographs on the inside, tracing the band's kind of life, right? Very young Michael Stipe, kind of very first sort of band photo there, or very early band photos. With these bright-faced young men of my generation. So, REM was in business as a band for 30 years, so there are people who kind of came in and out of this group. And I'm just going to say it out loud, man. I was an OG REM fan. So OG that we didn't even say OG back then. I was in college when the greatest college radio band of all time released their first EP, which I bought and loved and just played over and over and over again. Was an enormous fan. I've said this already oh, God. I went to school at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, which is a thriving metropolis I'm sure you've heard of. And REM played there it would have to have been when Murmur came out or was about to come out. That was their first full-length album. And in the cafeteria of the student center on the campus, I was already a fan. I did not go to that show, which was attended, I understand, by 10 or 15 people, because I didn't have the $3 necessary to walk in. What was it, a couple years later, I paid $12 to see them in the auditorium when they were touring for Reckoning, which is one of my all-time favorite albums of all time. All time. All time. And so it was rectified, but, right, and so being in Southern Illinois, there was sort of a contingent of students who were coming from more like the suburban St. Louis area, in really, I guess, Western Illinois, right on the Mississippi, across the Mississippi from St. Louis, including Collinsville, and one of the guys who lived in the dorms right next to me, his brother and Michael Stipe were really good friends. And then there was this other girl that we all kind of knew, this group of kids, college kids that you would know. And she knew him from, the old hometown. And so they kind of hung out with them, and I knew them, and I don't know. So this was the brush. They brushed right past me. I brushed right past them. And so but then also I was art student guy. I was punk rock guy at the time. I guess I am still to a smaller degree. I don't know. So this is why this book kind of got to me right away. Because it begins, of course, with who are these guys? Why do we care? How did they become REM? And though it gets a little bit into their sort of their childhood and where they came from and stuff like that. Really, it's about how did they all get to Athens, Georgia, the University of Georgia. Um, how did they all get together? What was sort of the climate there? Who were their friends? The first time they played was for a friend's birthday party. And so that whole side of their lives, right, very, very beginning of this band, and who they were and where they were and the context within that, this group of art students, was so exactly like my experience at really literally exactly the same time. I think they were maybe, what, 3 years ahead of me in school, something like that. Um, that right away this book just got me in the nostalgia, and not in that sort of, oh, it's kind of funny, like my wife right now is watching for some reason Dallas. I don't know. She's working through that on her own. But it's sort of like, oh, it's funny. Look at all the funny, like, early 80s hairdos and stuff like that. Not in that fun kind of nostalgic way, but this kind of got me in that, like, nostalgic way. That was a little bit weird and it got weirdly dark. Because that was a great time in my life. I mean, oh man, college, right? I was also in a band, we'll put in quotation marks, or a series of things that approximated a band. Really long enough to know that I was never going to be a musician. That's just not where I live. But it was fun. And, I had a lot of fun with my friends, and and then it got a little bit weird where we're talking about, oh, we're a band, we're in this band. It's like, oh, are you guys are playing anywhere? And I'm like, no, we're not playing anywhere. Never played anywhere. That also kind of like their story of these kind of merging in and out of different bands, and kind of these were sort of art projects for people, including bands that you've heard of probably, if you're coming from this generation, then like, that were the Athens, Georgia bands, and the bands that they connected with in the college communities around there, more or less. Like Pylon and the DBs, and right before them, the B-52s had come out of Athens, Georgia, who they, ended up being friends with and collaborated with. So that stuff really got to me, and it made for sort of slow reading because it got to be really, you know, um, so it was complex feelings about this book that I liked. It's good in a way, right? And I'm not so hesitant to do anything like a book review, even though all these videos are book reviews. Um, it reconnected me with listening to R.E.M., making sure that I had every single one of their albums and so on. So that was super good. I've been listening to a lot of R.E.M. I would actually put on R.E.M. on iTunes, and then while I was reading this, so that was kind of cool. Um, so that was hard, right? The hard part of it, the weird nostalgia, the sort of, look back at a bygone era that is lost to the mists of time. The book itself, so the band very clearly did not participate in this. There's no interviews with them. He seems to be, he quotes people who kind of knew them when they were kids or worked with them a little bit, were also in the sort of Athens, Georgia music scene and art scene and so on. It is a historical, right, chronological story of the band that unfortunately fixates a lot on the music business side of it, right? How many shows they played, how big the audiences got little by little, and then, in a sort of, accelerating pace, how many albums they sold, how much money they were paid. how many trucks it took to bring their gear to concerts on big tours, and very little is sort of brushing past the surface of how they really felt about any of this, all of which were really gleaned from prior interviews, right? So he's quoting, they were on MTV News, there was an interview or an article in whatever, Rolling Stone or this, that, and the other thing. So in turn, there wasn't a lot of new information here. And it was only in the end that he kind of got into a little bit of negative stuff about them. They're, split with their longtime manager and best friend, who was always considered the fifth member of REM, over some sexual harassment stuff that was going on, apparently. And, any little bit of discord in the band was like, oh, they just kind of had this little argument that was very transitory, and then of course they're all just best friends, and they just came right back to that because it reads like a puff piece. I said it. I didn't want to say that out loud, but it does. It is basically like, the structure of the book is basically they got together and wrote songs, which they all wrote together, and it was just this great, amazing, creative experience. They sometimes argued about stuff, but in the end, they created their best album ever. So each album was their best album ever, which they would say in interviews because they were really famous for just messing with interviewers and saying weird stuff and contradictory stuff in interviews on purpose, right? But it felt like Carlin kind of read that into the record. And so, each album was the best album they ever made. And then there was a lot of like, then it really sold this much. And then this video was in high rotation at MTV. And the business, until it finally gets to really the Napster era, when the entire business part of it just goes away almost. And so then it's the story of, here's how much less this next album sold, even though it was their best album of all time. It does tell the story of the drummer's aneurysm that he suffered on stage in Switzerland, which, kind of reset his priority system, although it doesn't really say that. They did another album together, and then he finally left the band. And they pushed on doing some interesting music still, right, as a threesome, but it was sort of, it was really tough, and it was really hard for them in that first album, and you could kind of hear that it wasn't their greatest thing of all time. And then they got their feet back underneath them, and then they made their best album ever. And until they finally just were like, I think we've said everything we have to say, which I really applaud. That's to be a rock star and then say, yeah, I think it's just weird to be a 50-year-old rock star. Let's just say we're not going to be the Rolling Stones and be playing, when we're 90 years old. So that was the part of this that was not super great. It didn't really bring me deeply into their creative process, which is what I love about books like this. So that's the expectation, right? The history of the band in a little bit more of the business end of it than I was hoping for. But then this whole first section of it just really got to me. So, right, a qualified success here. I'm very happy I read it. And I'm very happy that it helped me kind of reconnect to that music. I've never stopped loving R.E.M. But, there's new things, and they kind of slide away, and now they've slid back, and that's good. So that was my primary nonfiction book. Again, number 11. We're 11% of the way through the 100-book challenge, if that matters. So what's the next? I know you're on pins and needles for the next primary nonfiction book. Oh, boy, do I need a little bit of, let me do this so that you can hear me. Do I need a little bit of, or a significant amount of optimism right now? This is Not the End of the World by Hannah Ritchie. That I've already read the introduction this morning. This is not a book that says, everything's actually fine. Don't worry about it. It's a book that says, no, actually, there are significant, terrible problems, not the least of which is climate change. However, right, strides have been made to mitigate that. And there are things that we can do, we can be doing to help solve that problem. At least start to mitigate that problem and move toward a solution, right? No, the Earth is not going to become uninhabitable the second we pass that 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold, right? It's not going to be good. And there are things that we can do about it. And this book promises to be focused on what we can do. And here's what I'm hoping, and what it sort of promises is what you can do, even if you are not the CEO of some giant corporation, even if you are not a politician, even if you are Phil out here making videos screaming into the void with zero actual power. So this is what I'm hoping to get out of this. We're not all just going to die, but a lot of people are. And what can we do about reducing the number of those people, right? What can we be doing positively, constructively, and optimistically, even if we currently have, here in America, this book was written and published just before the second coming of the Antichrist. So that's not helping. But what can we do nonetheless? As we start, as we're still seeing this sort of the ever unfolding collapse of American conservatism, the ever unfolding collapse of the Republican Party, which is going down violently, swinging. I don't know what you want me to say. I'm leaving myself in the hands of Hannah Ritchie, and I promise to report back and let you know how constructively optimistic this book makes me. I'm rooting for it. I'm rooting for myself, and I'm rooting for the human species. Thank you. Comment, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. Okay, the 100 Book Challenge. Episode 11. Thanks, everybody.